Welcome to the Sword and The Trowel, a podcast of Founders Ministries. Founders Ministries exists for the recovery of the gospel and the reformation of churches. I'm Jared Longshore.
And I'm Tom Ascol, and this is a special edition of the Sword and The Trowel.
Of the Sword and The Trowel. We're glad to have you with us, and we're delighted to have our dear brother Voddie Baucham with us, author of Fault Lines, The Social Justice Movement, and Evangelicalism's Looming, Catastrophe. Before we get into our discussion today, you should know that we're having a conference down here January in Southwest Florida called Militant and Triumphant. Voddie's going to be with us. You'll be preaching, I'll be preaching, James Coates will be preaching, Conrad and Bayway will be preaching, and our brother Travis Allen will be preaching. You can register at founders.org.
Yeah, let me also say, this has not been announced until this very moment, that Voddie's going to be with us September the 12th and 13th as well, which is just right around the corner. So here in Cape Coral, we'll be preaching our church on the 12th, and we'll be having an evening with him on the 13th, doing something for pastors at noon on that day. So you want to check your calendar, get down here. So Voddie, brother, it's good to see you all the way from Lusaka. Tell us, first of all, how's your health?
Man, health is great. I'm doing fine. Just getting stronger, training like a madman, just trying to stay healthy, trying to take care of all of this work that they did.
Yeah, man. You had a long time away, so I'm sure you're playing catch up still at African Christian University, and I know y'all been hit with COVID again, and so you've had to scale back some things, and we're grateful that you're there, grateful that you are here with us at Founders too, part of IOPT, one of the founding faculty members. We open our classes up in just a few weeks here, so if you want more information on that, you can go to instituteofpublictheology.org and get information there. But
we know what we need to talk about.
We're talking to you today because we heard a rumor that somebody's upset with something you wrote and said, and we're not sure, but it seems like somebody said something somewhere.
Yes, Joel McDurmon said something. He said something, and look, we take plagiarism very seriously. We've got the Ed Litton thing going on. We've hit that. We don't take nitpicking as seriously.
Or dishonesty.
We don't take dishonesty as seriously. But Voddie, you're such a kind, faithful brother. You want to be willing to come on here and let's talk about what Joel has said. McDurmon wrote this piece, and he's charged you with plagiarism and some other kind of things that are going on. So we thought, why don't we just get down into the nitty gritty and talk about these things. So let me tee it up for us. Yeah, he began by pointing to a block quote in your book. At least it's indented off. And so you've got this indentation, and then in there you begin to list off some items about racism being normal and other tenets of critical race theory. And he is claiming that some of the things you say in there are not words from Richard Delgado. So what do you say to that first charge about, hey, here's this place where you're saying things about CRT kind of in the wake of signaling Richard Delgado, but these aren't really Richard Delgado's words. What would you say to that, Voddie?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say you really hit the nail on the head when you said, block quote, but actually these things are indented off. The format is an issue there, and it's not a block quote. Right. It's not a direct quote. Even from the first words, I'm giving an outline. I'm using Delgado's outline as an outline that I'm giving to the reader. And the first thing is that's part of the front matter of the book. The idea was, hey, when people get into the book, we immediately start off with some assumptions. So the editor said, what if we put something, before that? Or what if we extended the introduction? And I had the bright idea of doing this thought line, getting fancy with the spices. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give people a view from 35,000 feet, a view of what I'm going to be talking about, a view of the arguments that I'm going to be making, and a view of the ideologies that I'm going to be dealing with. That section of it is indented, it is blocked off, but it's not a block quote. That's obvious from the first words that it's not a block quote, because I'm giving a heading that's not Delgado's heading. I'm using Delgado's order and organization and structure. but I'm not directly quoting Delgado. Another thing that sort of indicates that it's not a block quote is that, in the middle of, I think that second paragraph, there's a footnote in the middle of the second paragraph, which is something that you wouldn't do
right
in a block quote, right? So, on the one hand, there's some structural and formatting issues there that are unfortunate and that are unclear.
One thing too, Voddie, I it's been a long time since I've gone back and read Turabian, but I had to live in it for a long time as well. But I don't even think this is conformable to Turabian style for block quotes, because you have indentations at certain points for your headings, which I don't think Turabian does in block quotes. I think every paragraph starts non-indented. But it's, again, if we want to play nitpick, I'll nitpick.
Yeah.
But that's not even the point.
Yeah. But it was not meant, and I think you're just making the point that I'm making. It was not meant to be presented that way, to be understood that way, or to be read that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wish that I had made other choices. Again, I don't want to throw my editors or anybody else under the bus. This is me.
Sure.
I did that. I presented it that way. I was, trying to really give a big picture and separate those ideas off. But it was not intended to be understood as a direct quote. I didn't use quotation marks. I have block quotes in the body of the book. And again, this is front matter. This is not my argument. This is, I want to introduce some ideas. I want to make some connections for you. I want to explain some things to you, before we, sort of get into this. Mm-hmm. So that was the first issue there. What's interesting though is, just like you said, Tom, if you read this, it's pretty obvious that this is not direct quotation.
Exactly.
It's pretty obvious that this is not direct quotation.
Right.
Especially with there being footnotes in the middle of what's blocked off.
It's a very poor block quote.
Well, you also have this problem of in McDurmon, when he's quoted you here, he's kind of pasted part of your book, and he's highlighted certain sections, and he's saying that, well, you're misrepresenting him here. I mean, that's the general nature of what he's trying to say. He actually has a section where he says, to be redundantly clear, these red sections are not in Richard Delgado's words. Nowhere in the book Voddie cites do these words appear. Now, one of the red sections that McDurmon has highlighted of your words is where you say racism is normal. And you're saying racism is normal. You go on to say the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Well, I've read Delgado, and when I heard that, I said, this actually is sounding a lot like Delgado. I don't think that Voddie is misrepresenting what Delgado was, how he was using it as a framework. And so I went back to look at Delgado. You actually footnote the end of the sentence I just read. You footnote this very page in Delgado, and Delgado is explaining the tenets of critical race theory. And he says first that racism is ordinary. Okay, so in yours, you say racism is normal. He says racism is ordinary. And you have McDurmon trying to hold that up, highlighting your word normal in red and saying, well, Delgado's never said that. Okay, well, no, he said racism is ordinary. And then he goes on, Delgado, to say the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. I'm saying Voddie is not misrepresenting what Delgado actually wrote.
He uses the word normal elsewhere. When he's talking about this same point as well. But again, the idea here is that I'm not quoting Delgado directly. I'm using Delgado's framework. There are a number of people who give, various versions of this, same framework. And whether you're talking about ordinary or normal, you'll see that in various frameworks. But it's not a direct quote of Delgado. That's true.
Let's talk a little bit about another charge of McDurmon. So McDurmon has a section in his piece where he's claiming that you copied from James Lindsay. And so in that section, you talk about storytelling. And as I went back and looked at Delgado, there's massive portions of the topic of storytelling. So it didn't strike me as you taking what Lindsay said. Somebody would have to read McDurmon's piece to look at that. But what do you have to say about that particular charge there, Voddie?
Yeah, I also, in the next section, I quote, Terry Yasso from another very popular piece on this. And again, this was not a direct quote of Delgado. This was giving people a picture of the basic tenets of critical race theory, a view from 35,000 feet. Delgado is being used there, really. I mean, it's his structure that he gives to this. And, much of the essence of what he says about this structure that he gives to this. But my goal here was not to give direct quotes to Delgado or to even argue that Delgado is, the definitive person on critical race theory. I mean, his book is seminal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I did, want to acknowledge that. But just like I said before, this is not a direct quote of Delgado. But here's what's also interesting about that. I quote Lindsay several times, not only in the book, but also in this, sort of thought line. Why is it that, why am I going to cite Lindsay and then not cite Lindsay in other places? I have no qualms about the fact that I worked with Lindsay. I have no qualms about the fact that, James and I became friends. James and I have had many discussions about these issues. What am I hiding from? Why am I hiding? That's number one. The other issue is that if you read the literature, these things are ubiquitous in the literature. And my goal was to communicate these main tenets, to get people to understand these four main tenets. So, I agree with Lindsay. I don't see it.
Yeah, James Lindsay said this: Voddie allegedly plagiarized me, and I'm not seeing it. They're just trying to discredit people who are upsetting their racket. It looks desperate. And I think that's a very good analysis of this. What you said, and when they try to put your words next to Lindsay's, it's not word for word. Are you saying the same thing? Absolutely. Well, you're reading the same literature.
Yeah.
And it is everywhere in the literature.
Yep. So people have to go, and you can go read McDurmon's piece if you want to see the exact words. I'm not even going to take time to read it because I agree with what both you men have said about it.
The other irony there, of course, is that on the one hand, I'm guilty of not quoting directly in a box quote or a block quote, right? And a block quote says, "These are not my words." But then on the other hand, I'm guilty of plagiarism, which means that you're saying these are my words, right? So I don't know what to do with that. I acknowledge the fact that structurally, from a format perspective, this was a bad choice. This wasn't as clear as it could have or should have been, and I own that.
That's miles away from plagiarism. So that's trying to charge you with plagiarism on that slim evidence is skating on very thin ice.
On a phrase, that's and that's. Let me just say this too. I haven't been addressing criticisms, arguments, all this kind of stuff. I haven't been doing that. One of the reasons that I wanted to agree to talk about this now is because people are trying to use this as a wedge and sort of leverage it, specifically with the stuff that's going on in the Southern Baptist Convention.
Right.
Plagiarism is a big deal right now. And so, there's this kind of, well, hey, Voddie's guilty of it. And, a mutual friend of ours, I talked to yesterday, he was getting ready to get on the phone with somebody who was pressuring him to call for my resignation because he had been calling for Ed Litton's resignation.
Yeah.
Over a phrase that's similar.
Yeah. There's a difference between reading another person's sermon, a script, telling his illustrations that happened in his boyhood as if it happened in your boyhood, and indenting words that shouldn't have been indented.
And let's get down to the nitty gritty. Well, what McDurmon is charging you with is misrepresenting Delgado. That's really what it's about. That's what he's trying to claim. And I've already read a portion to show in the first tenet of critical race theory that you identify. You call it, I believe, normal, and Delgado calls it ordinary. And then you both use very similar terminology to describe what that ordinary or normal tenet is. So there is no misrepresentation. And probably the most important, as I see it, the most significant thing to address is McDurmon claims that you're basically making a false implication of interest convergence, and that is that white people are therefore incapable of righteous action. He talks a little bit about you using the word righteous and attributing it to Delgado. You can address that if you'd like to, but the more important thing in my mind is it true that interest convergence, the way that Delgado and other as critical theorists in general define it, does it then result in white people being incapable of righteous action? Sounds like McDurmon says, no, you're wrong about this. I don't think you're wrong about this, and would love for you to speak to it.
Yeah, there's two issues here. One issue is the substance and whether or not it's right to make that statement about the substance, about what interest convergence means, what interest convergence implies. There's a second issue, and the second issue is, the attribution of that statement to Delgado. And, let me just say that is not Delgado's statement. And what's interesting about that is, I've been talking about this a ton. Right? I've been talking about this all over the place. And unfortunately, what I have done is I have read that statement the way it is in the book without making a clear distinction between where that footnote is and where I'm making a clarification. And I've done that. I don't know how many times I've done that, but I've done that. And man, I regret doing that because, number one, as you see in the book, I put the footnote there and then I give an explanation, right? And it's clear that that's what I'm doing. Let's set aside the fact that it's in the block. We've already dealt with that. It would have been much clearer if it wasn't in the block. And not only does that lack of clarity, show up in terms of, what people are reading, but it's also showed up in terms of me reading that same thing. I've read that as though that was Delgado, and it wasn't. That's my comment on interest convergence.
And so, Voddie, when you do, that's a mistake. I mean, when you read it as if that's just a mistake.
Yes.
Okay. Let me just pause here. I want you to finish your thought, but we got a teaching moment here. Okay. There's a difference between what we just heard from you saying this was wrong. It was a mistake. I misread this as my word, as Delgado's words. They were my words. There's a difference between that, owning it, and saying, well, if anybody was offended by what I did, I'm sorry. I just want to apologize to anybody that might have been offended by what I did. All right.
Well,
can we just go to school on here?
I apologize to Richard Delgado. I do.
Yeah.
And he's been gracious in his response to this. And I really appreciate that. I don't know him, but I really appreciate how gracious he's been in this. And I believe even saying that, I must have been mistaken, or I must have not, whatever. And I was. And ironically, it goes back to this same thing. So here it is. I'm like, I want to give people, and I think it's helpful when you give people this view from 35,000 feet,
Absolutely.
when you talk about these ideas and, express these ideas, one of the things, and we've talked about this before, one of the things that I do often when I speak about it is I'll take that first point and I'll say, because again, this is going to go to what we're talking about with using the word righteous. Because I stand by that. I stand by my assessment of the fact that interest convergence theory implies that white people are incapable of righteous action when it comes to issues of race and racism. And I'm going to come back to this. But what I've often done is I'll give that first point. And that first point is, that racism is normal, so on and so forth. And I'll say this is akin to original sin. And again, I'm talking about the way that it's used. I'm not saying that Delgado says that this is original sin, right? I'm saying that this first tenet, as it's deployed in praxis, because there's theory and then there's praxis with critical race theory. As it's deployed in praxis, you get this idea of original sin. For example, Jim Wallace in his book, America's Original Sin, Ibram X. Kendi and his proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the anti-racist amendment to the U.S. Constitution. He talks about because of the original sin of racism, right? Now, these guys are doing critical race theory. And I know there are a lot of people who don't like it when I say that, because what people want to do is they want to say, no, critical race theory only exists within law schools, within particular frameworks. It's never gotten outside, right? And nobody else is doing critical race theory except for Delgado and Crenshaw and a few other people. That's the only people who are doing critical race theory. So when I talk about the fact that D'Angelo and Kendi are the two principal exponents of critical race theory today, what I'm arguing is that based on these principles, and the first one, that idea that racism is normal, and I argue that that's akin to the idea of original sin, and they use that. And then the second one, the idea of interest convergence, that white people only undo racism when it benefits them. That is what I mean when I say the implication is that white people are incapable of righteous actions in the area of race and racism. And I still argue that that is consistent with the tenets of critical race theory. And it is consistent with the praxis, with the way that people are working out critical race theory. And so, again, that's the second issue there. The first issue, again, no, those are not Delgado's words. And I make that clearer, unfortunately, in the book than I have in using my notes from that. But at the same time, I am arguing, and I mean to argue, that the second premise of critical race theory implies that white people are incapable of righteous actions in the area of race and racism.
One point that needs to be highlighted here as we go on is that this is just the warp and woof of theological argumentation. You look at positions, you critique those positions, you try to make your case. And so the fact that Delgado never says white people are incapable of any righteousness or doing anything right doesn't mean that there are no implications to the position he has outlined. And it's a really useful, necessary way of arguing. This is showing this is what you believe, therefore this is the implication. What do you do with the implication? And that's how the argument is further down the road.
Yeah, and there's also this is a fine point, but there are theological discussions where we could say if you hold A, then it seems you're going to have to hold B. but another person might have a caveat that would stop them from holding that particular implication. But I don't think that's exactly what's going on here, honestly. There's also, no, you have stated this particular statement, right? Interest convergence. This is what you call interest convergence. And that very definition of the thing you say, this is an implication that's undeniable. It's not, I don't see a caveat, and maybe somebody could show me one, and I'll say this, and then Voddie, maybe you could speak to this. This is why it seems perfectly accurate to me for you to say that interest convergence implies that it's that white people are incapable of righteous action, because Delgado himself, in the glossary of his book, Introduction to Critical Race Theory, I believe is what it's called, the online PDF version, page 149, he has interest convergence, glossary term, and then this is a quote, thesis pioneered by Derek Bell that the majority group tolerates advances for racial justice only when it suits its interest to do so. Now, if white people are the majority group, and they are, and they will only tolerate advances of racial justice, white people only tolerate advances of racial justice when it suits them, that is unrighteous. That means they are incapable of righteous action. Connect the dots for us, Voddie.
Yeah, and again, Jared, you and I have talked about this, and when you're dealing with critical race theory, when you're dealing with the literature, and when I say the literature, what I mean is the academic literature, right? This sort of history of how it's come to be, and also the contemporary literature, you see this playing out. For example, I've argued that D'Angelo is dealing with this in White Fragility. What she's talking about in White Fragility is this idea of interest convergence. When she talks about, for example, white complicity and white equilibrium, and then the idea of white fragility, the idea that white people won't dismantle whiteness, and that they'll fight to hold on to white privilege and white supremacy and so on and so forth. When this really struck me, there are a number of things that struck me about the religious nature of this ideology, especially the way that it's being used today. But D'Angelo uses the word righteous more than half a dozen times in White Fragility. It's clear that we're talking about this in religious terms, that we're taking these principles, we're taking these major tenets of critical race theory, and then we're applying those tenets in terms of its praxis. And again, that's just one example of many of the way that this is used.
And if people want to critique you on this, they can go to chapter 4 and engage you there, where you deal with this at length.
I write a whole chapter on the religious nature of, really, I'm talking about critical social justice more broadly. But I write a whole chapter on the religious nature, really, of anti-racism and these things, which are advancing the core tenets and principles of critical race theory. There is no doubt. And so, that's why I make that statement. That's why I make that clarifying statement. I'm signaling to the reader that this is why this tenet is important.
I think that's such an important point that we need to put this book on discount.
Let's do it.
50% discount.
50% discount.
How many copies?
However many you want to order, 50% discount between now and a week from now. So a week from today, whenever you hear this, 50% discount. But we're going to need a special code. Special code that you're going to have to enter whenever you order this book. So
McDurmon
it is. Put McDurmon in the special code, 50% off. So what he has attempted to discount and could not do, we're going to discount for you, so you can have the real deal. You can actually have the book. But more than that, let's give away some copies.
Okay.
All right. I want to give away 10 copies of this book because these accusations that are so flimsy, and some of them godless, have been made against our brother. We want to spread his words as far as we can. So if you'll share this episode of the Sword and the Trowel and get people to watch this, listen to this, and then tag founders in it. So when you share it on social media, tag founders in it. We're going to have a drawing. We'll give away 10 of these books. It won't cost you anything. We'll absorb all the costs and shipping and get them to you. So we want people to read this book. We want people to hear Voddie. And before we go, again, it's a teachable moment. Why have so many people jumped on this and said, oh, look, it's a morally equivalent situation to what Ed Litton did when he was reading off of scripts for sermons that he claimed to be his own that were not his own. This is a morally equivalent thing. Why have people done that? We need to ask the question, what's motivating people to do this?
And I want to add, man, Voddie, I praise God for you. I thank you, brother, for being an example to many. When you do good work, there are going to be mistakes. There are going to be people that slander. There's going to be a mixed bag sometimes. So praise the Lord for coming on here and saying, look, all right, the indent, hey, could have typeset that better. And hey, no, straight up, I didn't lift from Lindsay. Just false. I'm not going to sit here and do that. Righteous. Sorry, I attributed that word to Delgado. But hey, by implication, I mean what I said. I do. That is a wonderful example to so many people. And guys, you got to learn to do the work.
Absolutely.
Don't back down. Rightly own what you can, just how Voddie has demonstrated for us, and don't own things that are not legitimate. You've really demonstrated that well, brother.
Absolutely. It's underscored the grace of God and the gospel in your life.
And let me just say, though, that, the reason that this is important to me is because I do believe that this is a sinister ideology that is confronting the bride of Christ. And, that's more important to me than, saving face. That's more, I'm grateful that this was brought to my attention. I didn't even realize that I had, basically when I put it in my notes and, began to speak about it, that I didn't realize that I had done that, that I had taken this formatting issue, and taken that statement that I absolutely mean, and that it's absolutely meant to clarify, but just sort of read it together, and in a way that, sort of attributed it, in a way that it shouldn't have been attributed. So listen, my goal is truth.
Amen.
My goal is the gospel. I hope I never think so much of myself that I can't acknowledge if I make a mistake, but at the same time, to turn this into what it's been turned into is incredibly unfortunate and disheartening.
Yeah.
And I just hope that, as this goes forward, that that the Lord his truth is vindicated.
Amen.
That I don't serve as a stumbling block, and that people will recognize what's happened here, and that it doesn't principally change
Amen.
the argument. It doesn't principally change what I'm doing. It doesn't principally change what I'm teaching. It doesn't principally change what I'm trying to achieve.
Yeah, Voddie, that's well said, and it is unfortunate, and that's true, I think, for most people. For some other people, it's wicked. They are wickedly operating outside the boundaries of scriptures, and those who are Christians, especially those who are Christian leaders, ought to be ashamed of themselves for doing so. Proverbs 18:17 says, the one who states his case first seems right till another comes forward and questions him, and anybody who decides a matter before he hears it is a fool. And may God help us all to learn lessons from this and to humbly submit ourselves to his word and do the best we can. When we make mistakes, own them. Where we sin, we repent, we get up, we start over. But we are operating as truth brokers. We're not operating as platform builders or those who are trying to save face.
Amen, brother.
Amen.
Voddie, thanks so much for being with us today. It's been wonderful. And thank you all for listening to the
brother.
Sword and the Trowel today.
Thank you. Hey, I appreciate you guys, man.
See you, man.